What's going on, adventurers? Welcome to another episode of Big Game Basics by the Adventure One podcast. So I think the last episode I didn't even have a name for this series, but I realized I wanted to talk about short, topical conversations related to big game hunting. Whether you're a new hunter who is just soaking this stuff up like a sponge, or maybe it's been a couple years since you've gotten out in the deer woods and you're just wanting to kind of look back on the basics and just kind of freshen up and learn it a little bit. Or it's something where you just listen to all kinds of content and opinions, and maybe you have your own and you want to challenge mine, or maybe you want to send me a note, there's something I can learn from you, or you just want to be a part of the discussion. These big game basics conversations are meant to just touch on specific topics related to big game hunting. Not necessarily to be full-length episodes, but just to be quick, topical episodes. So last episode, we talked about the moon. Does it affect the rut? Does it improve deer movement? Does it make deer shy away? What is the effect of the moon on your hunt? So go check out that episode if you're looking at your lunar calendar and you're trying to decide how you should hunt based on what the moon is doing. You may pick up something from that episode. So this week, we're going to talk about something that, in my opinion, is even more important than the moon phase, and that is the wind. So my background in reading the wind actually starts well before I started hunting. A lot of people don't know it because it doesn't really come up on my channel or any of my videos very much, but I used to really be into sailing. Mostly small boat sailing, just on lakes, dinghy class stuff, not big oceanic schooners and yachts. Just small boats, lasers, opties. Coronado 15 was a favorite boat of mine that I had for years and years, and I learned sailing from my dad. That was a passion of his, and even a summer job he had for a while. I think it was summers while he was in college. He would basically get paid when people purchase yachts in Mexico or the Caribbean to basically sail them across the Gulf to their final destination. And so I learned a lot about sailing and the water and the wind from my dad. And so growing up, being able to read the wind was important. Being able to know which way the wind was blowing, what it was doing, how to watch for the wind, all very important. But I didn't really understand how that affected hunting till many, many years later. It's one of the less obvious things to people who watch other people hunt or hear about their hunts. They may know that wind is somehow involved, but when you watch a hunting TV show, you can't see or feel the wind. When you're going shopping in the store and you see the camo and the bullets and the bows and arrows, you don't see anything about the wind. And there's not a whole lot of gear related to the wind. So I think to a novice hunter, it tends to be not noticed as much just because there's not as much gear and discussion that revolves around it nearly as much as there is scent and camo and accuracy and all these other important factors of hunting. But wind is critically important. And it's funny, it even came up in a sermon I listened to this last week. Basically, God was being described kind of like the wind, how you can't see the wind itself, but you can see effects of the wind, and that's how you can observe the wind. And I think that was a good metaphor to the commoner, but not only can we see the effects of the wind, but the more you can see and understand what it's doing, you can practically see the wind. And long-range shooters will know what I'm talking about when you're looking for mirage, and you're not just seeing grass moving, you're actually seeing air currents rippling as they're heating up and moving. And so if you know how to look, you can actually see the wind, but more importantly, you can see what the wind is doing, and you can learn a lot from that, and it can really have a huge effect on your hunt. So let's be super basic. Why is the wind important? Well, a lot of people know, it's pretty obvious. Most animals can smell better than most humans can. In their world, they're not barraged by billboards and lights and signs and art and all the things that we see and are blasted with visually every day. Their main source of input and signage is often smell. And so when we're so used to being visual creatures and navigating our visual world, that's almost the power of scent. to a deer or an elk or a pig or just about any big game animal, except turkeys. If you're going to count turkeys and birds as big game, I think a lot of people don't. A lot of people just say, no, they're turkeys. They're not big game. But they're not going to have any issue smelling you. But any sort of mammal that lives out in the woods generally has a far more keen sense of smell than you do. And so there are so many things that we can do to leave scent on the ground, in the air, on surfaces that we're not even aware of because we're not detecting it, but the animals that we're hunting are detecting it. And that's why the wind is so vitally important. Now, you'll hear stories of people say, yeah, my granddad would smoke and dip in the stand and it was always fine. He never got busted. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more in the scent control episode of Big Game Basics. But I think Grandpa was probably able to do that because he wanted to smoke, so therefore he played the wind right. And there definitely are things that you can get away with when you play the wind right that you normally wouldn't be able to. And I don't think that's a license to be brazen or to not, work on scent control or do anything else. But it's just a matter of stacking every advantage in your favor. Why would you ever want to hunt a stand in the wrong wind if you have a risk of totally ruining that stand for the rest of the season? Yeah, mistakes happen and the wind can swirl and things can change. But if you're intentional about it, you just stand to have so much more of an advantage than somebody who doesn't pay critical attention to the wind. Now, I'm definitely speaking in generalities here because you'll see animals walk completely counter to what you would expect based on the wind, what the wind is doing. You'll see animals that come from upwind and don't really bother to scent check anything, or they'll come from downwind of you and somehow not pick up on you. But for hunting mature animals, bucks and bulls that have survived for a long time, or the wild boars that have been shot at a time or two, those animals savvy up pretty quickly. And usually the fawns, some of the young does, some of the sows and piglets, some of the young cows and calves won't pay as much attention to the wind as some of the more mature animals. So that's why, yeah, you can still be successful if you make some mistakes with the wind. But if you're more critical of what the wind is doing and how you're playing that, you have a chance at the big boy. Now, to a meteorologist or most other scientists, wind is usually thought of as a vector, meaning it has both a direction and an amount of speed or power. And usually that's the only way it's described. But to a hunter or to a sailor or to a long-range shooter, both of those are important, but also knowing the consistency, how much is it shifting or how constant is it, is what's really important. Because if it's doing one thing, but not doing it consistently, you really may work differently in the wind and how you trust it and how the wind affects your hunt or your long-range precision shot or even when you tack your sailboat. And so because wind is always changing slightly in direction, in power, and what it's doing next, it's important to never assume that the wind is static. And when it feels still outside, it's not still. If you have a wind checker, there are many times where it's very obvious the direction that the wind's coming from, and there are some times where you just feel, I don't really feel it right now. Normally I'm good at feeling the direction of the wind and determining where it's coming from, but right now it just feels still. But if you blow a little wind puffer or throw some milkweed or something like that in the air, you'll notice that it still gets carried in a direction, and the wind is still affecting your scent and moving it around. And so it's important to understand what it's doing. So that's why I recommend to any big game hunter, having some sort of wind checker is critically important. I think as a bow hunter, it's at least as important as my rangefinder. And that sounds almost ridiculous after I just did a podcast about how I missed an elk because I didn't range him right. But if I didn't know which way the wind was, I probably would have never even gotten to that situation in the first place. So these wind puffers, really it's just to tell you where the wind is taking your scent and what it's doing. And there are all kinds of different devices and tricks out there, but don't overcomplicate it. The simplest is just a plastic bottle full of talcum powder, and you can just puff that in the air, and it looks like smoke, and you'll just see it carrying the dust in one direction or another. And if that runs out, you can buy another bottle of the same thing, but you can also just go to a hardware store and buy construction chalk, or if you're a rock climber or a gymnast, you may have some of that chalk laying around. Not the exact same thing, but it serves the same purpose in just picking up a very fine powder, throwing it into the air so like smoke you can see where it's going. Now, I would advise against using flour or anything like that. You don't want any food product that's going to have any scents or maybe cause critters to get into your hunting gear. You don't want that. But a wind checking device can be even as simple as just, I've seen a lot of people, and there's another YouTube show that's very popular right now, and the strategy that they always use is going into the field, they grab a handful of milkweed and stick that in their pocket. And so they'll just pull out little buds of milkweed and watch that little piece of fluff float through the air. Now, there are many things that can be done like that just because milkweed's not common where everybody hunts. So if it's not common and you don't see milkweed, you can do the same thing with cattail fluff if you see any of that. Or if you don't have either of those and you're stuck in a hotel or around the house and you need to come up with something quick, feathers are another really good option. Whether it's down from an old pillow or just a feather you found on the ground, it can be great to just stick in your pocket to show you the wind later. But I think for me, the easiest, the most consistent is the little puffer. So with this, you'll have a much better understanding of what it's doing. And I think the more you pull that out on a sit, either throw some milkweed or squeeze your puffer and see what it's doing, the more you'll kind of build this into your memory and into your experience of what's going on. So when you encounter these situations over and over again, they'll start to feel familiar. And one situation that I've absolutely learned is generally the stronger the wind, the more consistent it is. And that's why those lulls, just like I mentioned, those times where you feel like there's not really any wind, but you squeeze the puffer or drop the milkweed and you see it still going somewhere, a lot of times those lulls are very inconsistent because only the slightest change in thermals, which we'll talk about in a minute, or weather, or some other atmospheric thing happening can cause a shift or a swirl in your directional wind. And this happens a whole lot on slopes, in little eddy areas, in draws. There's a lot of places where people like to set up their stands because it's good cover, where it's kind of this wind trap where the wind can do really weird things. So when the wind is stronger, it's a little bit more predictable. Now, when the wind is extremely strong, a lot of animals hunker down. So it's a balancing act, right? You don't want to hunt when the wind is just blowing like crazy because you're probably not as likely to see anything. Animals don't feel safe. They can't hear. They're not going to come out as much. But in general, I would rather hunt in a 8 to 10 mile an hour wind than something that feels dead still to me any day. So something I just mentioned that's critically important is thermals. And so with the discussion of thermals, I think we first need to kind of break wind down into two major categories. There's thermal wind and then there's weather wind. So when you're out on the ocean, it's a great example of where you're pretty much only experiencing weather wind. Now, if you kind of blew that out big scale, yes, weather wind is caused by thermal wind in general. But it's also caused by just trends and the Gulf Stream and big picture things like that. But thermals are changes based on temperature in a specific area. So when you pull up your weather app or you go to weather.com or you turn on your cable news and they're talking about the weather that day and they're saying there's a southeast wind, they're not talking about thermals one bit. They're just talking about the prevailing wind, the main wind for that area for that day. And so that's weather. And so that's generally pretty predictable. Obviously, when storms come through, cold fronts, warm fronts, hurricanes, just about anything can change that. But meteorologists can generally see that change. Versus thermals are changing based on the topography of the landscape. And there's no way to kind of from a 30,000 foot view to be able to describe exactly what's happening there because it's going to change depending on where you are. And so while weather is pretty predictable and you can look that up beforehand, thermals are not. But both of them equally have an effect on your hunt and how animals smell and where your scent is carried. So at any moment, the wind that you're feeling is a combination of weather and of thermals. So here are the quick basics on thermals. It's generally all related to density, and it's basic physics, just stretched out across a landscape. So when any fluid, be it water or air or anything else, warms up, it tends to expand. When any fluid, with a few exceptions, cools down, it tends to contract. And obviously the most common exception to this is ice, where ice expands and it's larger than water. But most other fluids contract when they get cold. And not even fluids, but even things like metals get more rigid and tighter. That's why musical instruments can change pitch when it gets colder or warmer. Anything does this, and it's just basic physics. So with air as a fluid, it's very loose to begin with. So the amount it does this is quite a bit. So when a body of air warms up, it expands, and it takes up a larger area, and it grows. So generally what this means is it has the effect of moving uphill. The air that is condensed down on the ground starts to expand and take up more area. And so that expansion often feels like breeze going from down in a valley to up on a hill. If you hunt out west, you will have definitely experienced just the phenomenon of the wind can feel like it's coming from one direction, then as soon as the sun gets on an area, it feels like it's coming from the opposite direction. That's that thermal expansion that you're feeling. And so a lot of times this happens not the second the sun comes out, but as soon as an area starts getting warmed up, that breeze very quickly flips around the other way. And the inverse is also true. The wind may feel like it's very consistent, solid in one direction, but then as the sun goes down and things cool off, you'll start feeling a different breeze, a different wind direction. And that's the air condensing in an area. It cools down, so it's getting denser, so the air is literally sinking down into the valleys, down into the low points, because it's denser and heavier, and it's not trying to expand. And some people try to oversimplify this a little bit, and people will say, in the morning, the wind moves uphill, and in the evening, the wind moves downhill. And that's true at a certain time in most places, but when you say in the morning, you need to be careful because you're talking about after the sun shines on an area and that area starts heating up. That's when it starts moving uphill. It's not when you walk in the dark and get in your tree stand. That's when you're actually experiencing the coldest air that's going to be there all day. And then it's probably going to change. And so that's why I feel like hunters are often thrown off or tricked by this, or you say, oh, the wind switched. Sometimes that's because you're in an area of a little bit of an eddy current where the wind just kind of circles and swirls. But a lot of times it's because the thermals were read wrong. You thought it was going to be one direction, then the air started heating up and wind started pulling in another direction. And so what feels like a switch is just the thermal overriding or overpowering the predominant wind for an area. And what's also tricky about thermals is it's not just where you are. Think about every air molecule being connected to the one next to it. So if it heats up and expands in one place and that air starts moving out of the way, something needs to fill its spot, and so it pulls it along. So you could be sitting somewhere that's still in shade, but an area that's getting a lot of sun is now expanding, and that could be affecting the wind around you as well. So that's where it gets tricky, because depending on whether you're above that area, below that area, it could have drastically different effects. And so then this all just goes back to why it's so important to have that wind checker with you and not just pull out your phone and say, well, the weather app says, because while that's true, it's not true right where you are on the slope you are sitting on with the current temperature change that you're experiencing. I've also found that moving water can have an effect very similar to thermals. Now, I don't think this is truly a thermal effect. I think this is technically I guess it's a venturi. So like your toilet flushes, If you think about it, there's water in the bowl and then there's water in the tank on the back. When you hit the lever, you're not draining the water in the bowl. You're draining the water in the tank, and that water is dropping. But it's right next to the water in the bowl, and just like the wind, where you think about one molecule is chained to the next one and something has to fill the spot, that's what it's doing. So as one starts moving down, it starts pulling the other one down with it. So I think water has an effect, moving water has an effect on air currents in a similar way. A lot of times the wind can feel like it's one direction when you're on top of a plateau. Then as you start going down a slope, maybe you're experiencing a little bit of a thermal because you're on a slope, and so you're going downhill and you're feeling something. But then when you're down right by the water, it feels like the wind is going with the water, like the water is pulling it along. And I think directly above the surface of the water, some of that disturbance, that's truly what is happening. There's a venturi, and so the moving water is pulling just a tiny bit of moving air with it, and then the air that's next to it has to fill that space, and so on, to the point that you do get a very subtle breeze and a subtle change of direction when you're near moving water. Now, if you're by an open lake or some other body of water that's not moving in a strong, predominant direction, then it's probably not as much of an issue. This is usually caused by the movement of the water. Now, in addition to the movement of the water, there is also something called a sea breeze and a land breeze. And this is something that I was familiar with as a sailor long before I was familiar with it as a hunter. And this is a little bit different than the lake effect, which is kind of a condition that causes precipitation along the shores of lakes. People in Chicago know what this is all about. That's why they get so much snow. But the lake effect is purely moisture related. What I'm talking about here, the land breeze or sea breeze, is similar, but it's more related to the direction of the wind. So when I'm referring to a land breeze, I'm talking about a breeze coming from the land towards the sea, usually in the evening. And the cause of this is basically just because the water holds its temperature better than the land. So the air right above the water tends to be warm. So it's still rising and it's still expanding. Whereas the air over the land has cooled off before the air on the water. So it is not still expanding. So as the air over the water expands, the cool air on land is what's pulled in to fill its place. Just like we talked about the current over the stream or the water in your toilet, or when you're down in the valley and all the air tends to move uphill. It's a very similar effect. Now, in the daytime, especially in the morning, this tends to be the opposite. Or anytime it's hot, really, it tends to be the opposite. You often have a sea breeze. And so that is basically the air above the land that was cool now heats up and expands rapidly. So the air over the sea that was a little bit more consistent is now pulled in towards the land to fill the spot of that rising and expanding air. And so that's when you would have a sea breeze. Now, does having a land breeze or a sea breeze have a huge effect on hunting? Usually not, but it helps you understand the way that thermals work. That air in one spot heats up, rises, and there can't just be a void, a vacuum. And so that as it rises, something has to be pulled in to fill its place, and that is wind. Now, sometimes it may make a difference to have a land breeze or sea breeze if you're maybe on the coast hunting sea ducks, where you're looking at the way ducks land and the way they fly, and you notice that they tend to land into the wind. Now, I'm talking more about big game hunting here, not necessarily bird hunting, because while there's a lot of things that are common in terms about how you would set up in the wind between big game hunting and bird hunting, they really are two different worlds. Because one, I'm talking about how scent really is all I'm talking about is carried through the wind, versus the other, you're talking about how birds like to fly and like to behave in the wind. So to keep it focused on big game, I think understanding the land breeze and sea breeze is just helpful to understand thermals in general. And once you understand thermals in general, you can understand what the wind is doing in your spot outside of what the weatherman says when he says it's coming from the southeast. So there is a whole lot to this, and even when I was out on my last deer hunt, I set up in a spot that I thought was going to be decent for the wind, but I thought it was going to be coming more out of the southeast, but it was more coming due south and then even gusting a little bit out of the southwest. And I heard that unmistakable sound of a deer snorting me 150 yards away, a deer that I couldn't see, but a deer that had smelled me because of the wind and therefore was never going to come in and give me a chance. Maybe it was a doe, maybe it was a big buck. I suspect it was a doe, just because a lot of times when those mature animals smell you, they don't even make a sound. They know what's up, they're just getting out of there. Whereas sometimes a doe or an immature animal, their job is to raise the alarm when they smell something that's off. But all that goes to say that this is a lifelong pursuit of hunting. Whether you're looking at Native Americans hunting hundreds of years ago or people hunting today, the wind has still been one of the most powerful factors in determining, well, which way do you stock up on an animal? Where do we sit? Where do we go? Where are they going to go next? Where should I go next? How am I not going to get busted? It is a lifelong pursuit to master the wind in hunting. But if you can just learn a few basics and just generally play those right, then you're only worried about the minor details and the little shifts, and you don't have huge surprises and huge disappointments when the wind changes on you because you can learn and anticipate it. And I know this is really overwhelming and there's so much going on here, but if you only get one lesson out of this, it's that wind is critically important. And do not hunt the wrong place for the wrong wind. Often, even if you have a great blind set up, it's better to just go sit your ass on the dirt in the right wind than to be perfectly comfortable and perfectly camouflaged somewhere else in the wrong wind, just in terms of what you're going to see and what your true chances of success is going to be on that hunt. Wind is so important. So carry a wind checker, check the weather channel, check your weather app, see what it looks like it's going to do. A lot of times when there's a cold front, especially down here in Texas or anywhere in the South, that cold air, guess where it's coming from? It's coming from the cold northern states above us. So a lot of times when you see the temperatures change and decrease, you can anticipate the wind is also going to change in some way. Very commonly, it means cold air coming from the north. And the same thing with a warm front. When we have maybe a hurricane in the Gulf, you're probably going to see a lot of warm air moving up from the south. So you can look at temperature to also indicate what the wind is doing. But the biggest thing is check that wind, watch your weather app, learn as much as you can there, and learn, but don't trust it. Carry a wind checker in the field. Trust what your immediate data 3 feet from your face is telling you. And the more you can do that, the more you can learn how to stock in on animals from downwind and what is a safe hunting setup versus what is a risky hunting setup. And that's not to say that you should always play it safe, because like I mentioned earlier on, a lot of times these big mature animals, they're not going to walk into a wind that they know is a disadvantage for them. They're smarter than that. They're going to walk in from the direction where they have the advantage. So sometimes if you're hunting a mature buck and you know it's an older animal who's likely to do that, a lot of times a good strategy is setting up 90 degrees to the wind, so that when he comes from downwind, he's not sneaking up behind you and he's not going to bust you. But you're still safe in terms of you're not downwind of him. You're off to the side. And usually the longer range, if you're rifle hunting, the better the strategy is. When you're in really close proximity, when you're bow hunting, that 20 yards difference is just a tiny little puff of air away. And so it can get really, really risky. So hopefully that helps you just to decide, where should I hunt today? And you know what? That's a really good spot. But if I hunt there, man, there's a good chance of screwing that up and never having a good hunt there because I hunted in the wrong wind. So we're right at 30 minutes here. So this was longer than a short episode, but there was a lot to unpack in discussion of the wind. So hopefully you learned something. Hopefully this keyed you into thinking more about something. Maybe you knew it already, but now you're just thinking about it a little bit more. Or if you've got a hunting buddy who just doesn't understand why the wind's important or is always screwing it up, please send him a link to this podcast. Maybe he'll learn something. And also tune in to other Big Game Basics episodes as we talk about other topics similar to this. Hopefully we can all just kind of stay in touch and learn something together. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel where I film a lot of my hunts and then also talk about gear and just other travel stuff and just have a heck of a lot of fun. So make sure to check that out. I also post a lot on Instagram. I actually changed my Instagram handle recently. So it used to be Adventure One Life. Now it's Adventure.1 spelled out. So check that out on Instagram. Until next time, stay safe, be free, and never stop seeking adventure.